After a year in the Sudan, I was drafted back to Cairo, and because I'd been 3 years in deserts, I applied for a more humane posting, and eventually I was sent to what was then Palestine. So I was posted to a little place called Kiryat Motzkin on the shore of the Mediterranean, a little north of Haifa. I had heard about this Danish missionary that had a small children's home a little north of Jerusalem in a place called Ramallah, which was then a small Arab village. And everybody I'd met in the Sudan and in Egypt had said, if you really want a blessing, you need to go to that little children's home. So I got on a number 18 bus from Jerusalem, went out to the children's home, and arrived and found Lydia with 8 small girls all around her. And I was immediately impressed by the sense of peace, which was a very rare thing in the Middle East at that time.
We had a strict upbringing, but she was loving. And we were brought up with prayer and faith. Even I remember as very, very young, at one time we had no food, and Mommy said, come on girls. So we all had to kneel down and pray and ask God to send food. I remember it exactly now, I can see it. In the morning we opened the door and there was a basket of eggs outside our door and some milk. But we never knew who brought it. So that's how we were brought up, to believe in that God will supply all your needs, and He did. And He's still doing it, even now.
Mother had quite a ministry amongst soldiers, because there was a missionary. She was Salvation Army missionary in Egypt, and whenever they had leave, the soldiers that were in Egypt, she would say to them, you've got to go and see Miss Christensen. She has a lovely home with children, and she would be able to minister to you. And quite a lot of them came, and Derek was one of them.
And she made me very welcome, and we prayed together, and she gave me tea and so on. So when I got back to Kiryat Motzkin, I thought, that poor Danish lady, she's got all those children and nobody but an Arab maid to help her and very little money. So I said, I'll pray for her. And I was praying, and the Lord spoke to me, as He did quite frequently at that time. I would get an utterance in an unknown tongue, and then I would get the interpretation. And this time the message I got was, I have joined you together under the same yoke and in the same harness. And I thought, that's remarkable. Does that mean we're going to work together? So then I applied for a posting, because I didn't get on well with my commanding officer. And he was glad to get rid of me and recommended the posting. So I ended up, a little while later, in number 16 British General Hospital on the Mount of Olives. And there is where I ended my military career. Being now within easy reach of Ramallah, I began to take fairly regular trips out to the children's home. And one day I spoke to Lydia and I said, on the basis of what the Lord had said to me, I said, I believe God would have us to work together. And her reply was characteristic. She said, well, He'll have to work on both ends of the chain. However, I really became more and more attached to the children's home and to Lydia. And it was like, as you could say, an oasis in the middle of a dreary military career. At that time, Lydia had relatively little fellowship with other Europeans or other non-Palestinians. So my visits were very welcome. And we used to read the Bible and pray together. And eventually, I felt that God wanted me to be part of that children's home, which is the most improbable destination for a person with my background. So I can't exactly remember, to say the truth, how the relationship developed. But one day I said to Lydia, would you marry me? And without much emotion, she said yes. So that is how we decided to get married. And most of the emotion came later.
I remember Derek coming because we had a lot of soldiers coming to our home. Our home was open to the British soldiers or anybody who used to come in for prayer. And I remember Derek coming, and he came again, and he came again. And then one day Mommy said to us, and I knew there was something going on. I mean, I'd be about 16 then. I thought, there's something going on here.
We often thought it was they're coming a lot to see my older sister because she was a beautiful girl, very beautiful. And the shock of our lives is when we realized he was really coming to see Mother.
And one day Mommy said to us, come on girls, I'm going to tell you something. I said, what? Well, she said, there's this young man, and I said, yes, Derek, you know Derek, and he's asked me to marry him. And I said, Mommy, you can't. I said, we've been girls here all the time. I said, you can't have a man in this house. We've never had one before. So what do we want a man for now? You're managing good. We're doing all right. She said, just think about it. I'm getting older, and you girls one day will go and get married, have your own homes. And we all said, Mommy, we'll look after you. You know that. We will always look after you. That's not the point. She said, I need a bit of happiness. So we said, okay, we agreed. We like Derek. He's a lovely fellow. He is really a nice man.
I didn't care for him myself, if you want my real honest. After all, he came and he took Mother away from us, from me. I'm talking about myself now. I was very, very close to Mother. So when Derek came, it sort of kind of pushed me to one side a little bit. And when you're 13, it's not a very nice feeling.
It was very hard for him. You think about it. I mean, all women, no men in the house, 8 girls, and our mother. So I think he took on a very big, heavy job to have all those girls to look after them and be our father. I don't think it was easy for him neither. It must have. So we all adjusted very well. He was there for us if we needed him. We could go to him. And he was always obliging and helping us, whatever we asked.
He opened up an awful lot more to us, especially in my reading. It was wonderful. I just soaked it up. You know, he's terrific on memorizing Bible verses, and we memorized something nearly every day. So we learned so much more. He opened up a completely different chapter in our lives.
I'm glad he came to our home. I really am. It's lovely. So he made a difference, really. So we had a mom and a dad then. Not just mommy, we had a daddy too. So it was good. But on the wedding day, I remember I just sat in the church crying. I thought, my gosh, what's going to happen now? And I even told Mommy, you know what's going to happen. I mean, at one time we were all girls. You could just run out to the bathroom or whatever. You didn't have to worry about anybody being there. Now we had to dress decent and walk out of our rooms. We couldn't just walk out. And she said, that's right. But she said, I need happiness too, Tikva, you know that. I said, yes. So I'm really glad she had Derek in her life.
The fact that I asked Lydia to marry me and she said yes was really rather remarkable, because she was born the same year as my mother. And yet we never had any problem about that, the difference in our ages. When I communicated the news that I was planning to marry Lydia, my parents were disciplined English people, so they didn't display a lot of emotion. And I mean, I was their only son, so all the eggs were in one basket. And my father did write back and ask how old Lydia was. And I wrote back to him and said, it isn't customary to ask a woman's age. And he wrote back and apologized for that. They were really, I have to say, wonderful in their response in many ways. Well, then I had to get out of the army in Palestine, which was not normal. But by that time, I'd been appointed the chief clerk of the hospital, which was a job for a sergeant, and I was only a corporal. So I protested to the commanding officer, and he said, you are the chief clerk, so what could I say? But it worked out very well, because when I had to deal with all the official documents to get my release, I was in charge of all my own papers. So, and after a certain amount of time, I was permitted to obtain my discharge from the army in Palestine. Well, about the time I was discharged, just a bit before I actually came out of the army, on the 16th of February 1946, we got married with a religious ceremony. And it was one of those unusual days in Palestine when it snowed. So I heard later that when Lydia woke up and found it snowing, she told the children, "It's too cold to get married today." But they said, "Mama, you've said you're going to get married, you'll have to do it." So we met and we got married by a Jewish believer in a very simple ceremony without any fanfare or anything really to make it distinct. So I came out of the army, and then a little later, on the 17th of March, we had a civil marriage ceremony in the office of the district commissioner in Jerusalem. So I was religiously married and then legally married. And in fact, I was married, that's the truth of the matter. At the time we got married, the personnel of the home consisted of Lydia, 8 girls, and the Arab maid Jamila. Of the girls, 6 were Jewish. 1 was an Arab from a Muslim background, and the youngest was English. Our life in the home was very simple. We lived in Arab style, and not a wealthy Arab style. Our main items of diet were very coarse bread, olive oil, in which we dipped the bread and then sprinkled it with this thing called za'atar, which was powdered hyssop. And we had milk, we had some eggs, and plenty of bread and olive oil until it ran off the children's elbows as they dipped. And all that was amazingly cheap. You could fill a big earthen jar of olive oil for a few shillings. And a sack of Jaffa oranges cost 2 shillings at that time. And really it was a very healthy diet, in many ways much healthier than what we came to later in life when we were more, quote, civilized. The home was permeated with a spirit of prayer, because Lydia was a praying person. She was very busy. She'd be changing diapers or filling bottles or cooking, but she'd be praying all the time. And really the children grow up, for them prayer was something absolutely natural, as natural as breathing. And when soldiers came to the home, which they frequently did, Lydia would get the children down on their knees praying while she ministered to the soldiers. And I think many British and American soldiers never forgot the impact. Much later on, I worked with John and Elizabeth Sherrill on a book about Lydia, and they were very interested to know what kind of relationship we really had, but they concluded it was a real love relationship. We really came to love one another with a very warm and lasting love. And she was such an unusual person, you can't judge her by normal standards, really. And in a way, she never got old. I mean, she got old physically, but she was always full of vitality and never stodgy, never old-fashioned, although in many ways she was very old-fashioned. But I mean, she was so full of life that it made it easy. I mean, you know, God does extraordinary things if you're prepared to let him do them. I think one advantage I had was I was pretty prepared to let God do some extraordinary things, which otherwise he wouldn't have done. Obviously, he wouldn't have forced it on me. And I understood that, only I understood this after we were married. It said the yoke, same yoke and the same harness. The yoke was marriage, the harness was serving the Lord together. And after all, for 30 years we served the Lord together. And, 30 years of married life and service is not a little. And also, I'd have to say that I was the instrument of God to save the lives of the family, because probably without me, they would have been just massacred by the Arabs. And I'm not holding the Arabs accountable for that. That's just the way the situation was. They were enemies. During the actual war itself, there was comparative peace in Palestine between the Arabs and the Jews. When the war finished, that's when tension began. And during the years of the war, the family had lived, although they were nearly all Jewish, in an Arab village with security and with good relationships. But when the prospect of a Jewish state loomed on the horizon, the Arab attitude changed radically, which one can understand. And we felt that we would be safer to move out of a purely Arab village and into Jerusalem. So we made many attempts, we took many trips in by bus, but somehow we never could find anything that was suitable. Eventually I said to Lydia, listen, if God wants us to move to Jerusalem, we don't have to keep going to Jerusalem. God can send somebody to our doorstep in Ramallah, which was a really rather foolish thing to say. But within a week, an Arab contractor, an Assyrian from Bethlehem, turned up on our doorstep in Ramallah and said, we've just finished building a house in Jerusalem. Would you like to rent it? So we took a trip in. It was much larger and more high class than anything we'd ever lived in up to that time. But we felt that God wanted us to move. In those days, to get into a rented apartment, you had to pay key money, which would be 2 years' rent in advance. And for us, that was a very, very large sum of money. But it so happened that I had a life insurance, which an uncle of mine had bought for me, worth £500. So I cashed in my life insurance, put it in, and we just scraped by with enough money to move in. We moved into a house in an area which was then known as Upper Baca, on a road which was then the Bethlehem Road, but has now been turned into the Hebron Road, and the house we occupied is today number 90 on the Hebron Road. And so we were living there on the 29th of November, when the United Nations voted to partition Palestine and make a Jewish state. And at that time, relationships radically changed. Up to that time, Arabs and Jews had lived together in comparative peace. But once the possibility of a Jewish state came, they felt like they were enemies. And so in every area, well, if it was a purely Jewish area, nobody moved. If it was a purely Arab area, nobody moved. But if it was a mixed area, the different groups sized one another up silently without any statements made. And the ones who thought they were weaker just moved out without taking a lot of furniture or luggage with them. Well, our area in Upper Baca was a mixed area, and we said to ourselves, we're Christians, and it doesn't involve us. But we noticed that within a week or two, our Jewish neighbors had all disappeared. They concluded that they weren't equal to the Arabs in the area.
And you have to remember that in our home we were a very mixed nationalities. There was British, there was a half British and half Jewish, there was an Arab girl, and the rest of us were all Jews, even though of course we were Christians. And we felt that neither the Arabs wanted us because they were Jews, and the Jews didn't want us because we were Christians. So we were in no man's land, more or less, really, for us.
We received a rude awakening in a very remarkable way, an illustration of the marvelous foresight and provision of the Lord. One afternoon we received a visit in the home from a British Palestinian policeman, an Englishman, who came because he was seeking for spiritual help. So Lydia and I think 2 or 3 of the girls got together with him and we were praying.
And I was on my way home and it was beginning to get sort of dark, and you know how it is, gets sort of dark pretty quickly. And I noticed a truck, or a lorry as they call them then, outside of the house, full of Arab men. And I thought, what in the world are they doing here? And I realized they were talking to our neighbor. And I climbed the stairs, which were on the side of the house, to our apartment upstairs. And I crawled out to the veranda, which juts out to the front, so that I could hear what they were saying. And I heard one of the soldiers saying to the Arab soldier, saying to our neighbor, when do the British soldiers stop guarding this section? And he said, after midnight there won't be any more. So he said, okay, that's when we're coming to raid the home.
So Johanna, with her knowledge of the whole culture and situation, realized they were intending to attack us and undoubtedly to either rape or kill the girls. And I mean, I say that objectively, that's the way the situation was at that time. So we were in the middle of a prayer meeting with this Palestinian policeman, and Lydia had an utterance in an unknown tongue, and I got the interpretation. And I heard myself saying, I have delivered thee from the snare of the fowler. And just as I said those words, Johanna burst into the room, looking as if she'd seen a ghost, and told us what she'd overheard. And we had to decide what we were going to do.
And I went back into the house, and Mother looked at me. She said, what is the matter with you, Johanna? You look as if you've seen a ghost. And I related what I had heard.
So the British constable said he would go and phone headquarters. We didn't have a phone in the house. And he went and came back and he said, well, the headquarters officer says maybe we can have a patrol in the area at midnight, but a patrol would consist of 1 British constable, 1 Arab, 1 Jew. And the Jew was no match for the Arabs. The Arab wouldn't fight his own fellow Arabs, so it was no protection. So about 7 o'clock in the evening, we faced this crisis of what are we going to do? And we decided eventually that we had no option but to flee from the house while we could before the soldiers came back.
So it was about midnight, and we had to get ready. Mommy said, just put whatever you can on you girls, take whatever clothes, because we've lost everything, we lose it all. We knew that. So we all put as many clothes as we could, and I could remember us all marching. Every one of us had our Bible under our arms. Derek was at the head of the queue, and all the 8 girls and Mommy at the back. And we walked very quietly. It was, I think, on midnight.
If they had raided, I believe they would have killed every one of us. They would not have discriminated between whether it was a Jew or an Arab or a Christian. We were one family as far as they were concerned. And they would have just eliminated all of us. I was afraid, there was no doubt about that. But we believed that God was with us.
And so we just walked through the dark, deserted, silent streets of Jerusalem, not really knowing where we were going. But we ended up, after walking for about 30 minutes, at a vast sort of wall of barbed wire which surrounded a large area in the center of Jerusalem, which was called the security zone, which was the headquarters of the British forces and was very carefully guarded. And nobody could get in through this wall of barbed wire without a permit, and we didn't have permits. So there we were at the entrance, not knowing what to do. And the British constable said, well, I can go in because I'm a policeman. I'll talk to the commanding officer and find out what he'll say, ask for his permission. So we stood there for about half an hour, not having any idea what the future held. And then the constable came back, and he said, the commanding officer said, it's all right, you can come in. So we filed in through the hole in the wire fence, And really, we had no idea where to go, but we knew there was an Assembly of God mission building in the center of the security zone. So we headed for that and arrived, I suppose, about 11 p.m. and said, here we are, can you help us? Well, we were 10 persons. And they were very helpful. It was a large building, and they pulled out mattresses and did various things, and we all slept. 11 o'clock next morning, the American missionary in charge called for Lydia and me and said, through the Christian Arabs that we work with, I've had a message from the Muslims in the area that if you keep those Jewish girls there, they'll burn the house down. So that news traveled very fast. Now he said to me, you and Mrs. Prince are welcome to stay, but you'll have to find another place for the girls. So we said, we're all one family. Where the girls go, we go, and where we go, they go. So that won't work. Well, they kept us one more night, and then we were out in the streets again, wondering where we should go next, although this time it was daytime. So we headed for what was a British Pentecostal mission in an area which was later known as the Mandelbaum Gate. We arrived there, and again they were very kind. They took us in, cared for us. But this was essentially what you'd call a no man's area, no man's zone. It wasn't controlled by the Jews, and it wasn't controlled by the Arabs. They used to meet every night and fight it out with rifles and things like that. So it was a dangerous area. And every time we walked past a window, we had to get down on our hands and knees and crawl because we could have been shot at through the window. That's where we spent Christmas 1947. Early in 1948, we received a message from the American missionaries in the place where we'd spent the first 2 nights. They had decided to return to America, and they needed somebody to watch over the building in their absence. So they asked us if we would like to move back into the building, which of course for us was a great provision of God. So we did. We moved back into the building, settled in. It was a large building with 23 rooms and a basement and a sub-basement. And we weren't used to such accommodation, but we enjoyed it. But by that time, Jewish Jerusalem was surrounded by Arab forces, and they had cut off all food supplies. So the Jews were very short of food and on the verge of starvation. But again, God's provision was so marvelous because the American missionaries had stored some canned goods in a big box, I mean a large box with all sorts of things, forgot about it and left it behind. So we had that provision which carried us through as long as we were in that building. Then the British occupying forces decided to withdraw on the 14th of May, 1948. On the 13th of May, about 9 o'clock in the evening, a British officer knocked at our door and said, I just want to tell you, we're moving out, and tomorrow you'll be under the Jews. Well, under the Jews, we had no idea what would that entail. But after a fact, the Jewish civilians and the unauthorized military forces were very kind. But they received a nice little note in rather strange English from a young man named Pinchas, which in English is Phineas. And he said, would you mind if we use your garden as an outpost? Well, we knew whether we minded or not, he would do it, so we said we are very welcome. And so they moved in and they occupied the yard, the garden. So we had Jewish Haganah soldiers in and out through the house. Some of them became quite interested in our girls, so we had a real good relationship with them. Because Lydia had been through so many scenes of disorder and murder and destruction. She knew what to expect. So we prayed every day, and our prayer was very simple: Lord, paralyze the Arabs. The remarkable thing was that these Haganah soldiers would come in and they'd say to us, you know, we don't understand what's happening. We move into a place and we're outnumbered by the Arabs, and yet they do nothing. They're just as if they're paralyzed. the remarkable thing was not merely did God answer our prayer, but he gave us information that he'd answered our prayer. And we had a real warm relationship with those young Jewish soldiers. And our girls were very evangelistic. So they would play church in the garden while the soldiers were there. And our Arab daughter, Kirsten, was really quite a preacher. Of course, we were all speaking Arabic at the time. And she would give an impassioned sermon about the blood of Jesus. And then she'd come and tell Lydia, Mama, I was just telling that for the soldiers there. So those soldiers got the gospel in a way that they didn't probably expect. But we had a real wonderful relationship with them for a brief period. Well, when the British announced that they were leaving the country on the 14th of May, by arrangement with a Hebrew Christian organization, they agreed to take any Jewish Christians who would have been exposed to persecution if they had been left behind in a Jewish state. And so our 4 eldest girls were included.
We went to this Church of England in Jerusalem. It's a huge building. And from there, they came with English army trucks. And we had the Red Cross, one big truck in front of us. And they put us in this huge truck. There were quite a lot of us, Hebrew Christians. And they closed all the covers. And there was another Red Cross truck behind us. And I don't remember much, because when I got into the truck, I just fainted. I couldn't believe it, what's happening to us. And then they took us to Lyd, I think it's called Lyd Airport. And we went on the plane to Haifa. And from Haifa, we all went on the Georgic. It's a British troop ship that was taking the British to England. So we went on the British ship on the Georgic. And that was in 1948, May. But that was hard to leave Mummy and Derek and the girls behind, but we had to go. Because I had a hard time also with the Jews. I was taken several times and questioned. They knew I was a Christian, and they didn't like that neither. So I was taken a few times and questions. So we've had a tough time. I was glad to leave, really, at the end.
Meanwhile, the 4 younger girls and Lydia and I were left behind. And then the real fighting broke out on the 15th of May. And we were in a besieged city. We could never go out of our front door because we were being shot at from the old city. We had to go out through a side door. Well, to get information in besieged city is tricky. First of all, I had to go to the civil governor, whose name was Joseph, a Jewish man from Canada. And the British were by no means popular at that time, as you can imagine. And I stood in line for 3 hours, and I got to see him. I explained to him that I wanted permission to get out of the city, and he said, "You British, you stand at the end of every line and think you can go in anywhere." So I realized I wasn't going to get far with him. Anyhow, he said, "I can't help you. You have to go to the military governor." Well, in a besieged city, nobody tells you where the military governor has his headquarters. So I spent most of the day wandering around trying to find the military governor. When I got there, I said to myself, my mistake was I spoke English, so this time I'm going to speak Hebrew. And that really did, in a sense, create a different atmosphere. So he said, well, the last convoy is leaving Jerusalem tomorrow at 5 a.m. If you can get on, you have my permission to go. Well, the convoy took off from the King David Hotel in the center of Jerusalem, which was the headquarters of the United Nations. So I had to go there to get permission to get us on the convoy. It was run by a Swedish colonel, and it so happened that Lydia and I were representing a Swedish mission in Malmö in Sweden. So again, the Lord gave me a little wisdom, and I said, I'm the representative of Evangeliska Israels Missionen in Malmö, Sweden, and I need your help. And when I said Malmö, Sweden, the atmosphere changed. Meanwhile, the girls and Lydia had been praying that God would open the door.
And as I was praying, I saw this light. I had my eyes shut, saw this light at the end of this passage, and there was a gate right at the very end of this passageway. And as I looked at it, there were two figures in white came and opened the door, or these gates. And I remember getting up off my knees and being very excited and saying, "Mummy, Mummy, I'm going to England." And she said, "Why?" And she said, "Well," I said, "Well, God's really shown me I'm going to go." And I told her about this vision that God had shown me. And the situation hadn't changed at all, but I had real peace in my heart that God had answered my prayer.
And so we concluded that God had opened the way for us to get out. And we were intensely busy for the rest of the night, knowing that we had to be by 5 a.m. at the King David Hotel. We didn't have any money. Nobody had any food. So we just announced in the street that we were going to sell food. Well, the place was like an anthill all night. People came in and they didn't mind what they paid because money was valueless. And so by selling that food, we ended up with enough money to pay our fares, which we didn't know we were going to have to do from Haifa to London by plane. Another example of the extraordinary way that God made full provision for everything in advance. So next morning we were at the King David Hotel by 5 a.m. And again, this marvelous provision, the Swedish colonel put on a special little truck for us. So we were the last convoy, the last vehicle on the last convoy out of Jerusalem. And we were taken to Haifa, where we were taken in by people who ministered to the Jews. And eventually we were able to take a flight. The first airplane flight I'd ever taken in my life, from Haifa to London. I had mentioned previously that the 4 oldest girls went ahead of us. They were evacuated by the British military, which is just shows God can do anything when he gets the British Army working for you. And they arrived in England without, where were they going? But many British soldiers had come to the home in Ramallah, and some of them had left their addresses. And one way and another, the girls got in contact with these former soldiers, and they were fairly well taken care of. Some of them ended up with my parents in Somerset. My father had just retired and settled in a rather grandiose mansion in Somerset. And he and the girls got on unusually well, as a matter of fact, which rather surprised me. And he appreciated the girls, and one of them was very interested in gardening, which he was. So there was really a good relationship developed between my parents. And I have to say, in many ways, my non-evangelical parents were really more kind to us in some ways than some of the professing Christians. We had a very difficult time. We were scattered. We were in different homes. I had still had my income from Cambridge, which was very small. But really, we were just cast on the mercy of the Lord, and he sustained us. So here we were in London. Now there were 8 girls, and Lydia and myself, and we were really refugees. And it's hard to be a refugee anywhere, I'm sure. But to be a refugee in your own country is very testing. And we went through some real tests. However, many people were kind to us. Some of the Christians took us in, some didn't. Really, the people who were kindest of all were my own parents, which really surprised me. Gave me a different view of my own parents. Anyhow, we prayed earnestly. I ended up in Cambridge for a while. I still had the right to live in King's College. And I think it was Lydia's prayers that prevailed. We ended up in London and looking for an apartment that would be big enough to hold the whole family, which was 10 persons, which is not very easy to find, especially in central London. Well, I said to Lydia, let's look in the phone directory and see if there are any house agents. which was what we called realtors in those days. Well, there were no house agents listed, but there was a house agent whose name was House. So we got hold of him, phoned him, and he said, well, I have a place which suits you, but it's already rented. Well, I said, if it falls through, will you please let us know? And we prayed earnestly, and a couple of weeks later he said the other people were not able to take it. So that morning I had in my Bible reading when Jesus said to the disciples just before the Passover, go into follow such and such a man and take you to a large upper room furnished. And when we got to this apartment, that's exactly what the top floor was built on. It was the only house in a row of houses that had an extra top floor, and there it was, a large upper room furnished. So we began to settle down in London, and the girls were really rather intoxicated with London by comparison with Ramallah. It was a different sort of place. And I didn't know, but there's a place called Speaker's Corner, which all British people are familiar with. And in those days it was much more popular than it is today, because there were really no television. Very few people had money for cinemas. So you could get large crowds of people. And everybody had a right to proclaim his particular views. The only thing you were not allowed to do was criticize the royal family. If you did that, you would be arrested by the police. Well, anyhow, I never had any ambition to do that. So we were walking past that place once, and I said to Lydia, one thing I'll never do is preach in this place. Well, a little while later, we were back in Hyde Park and saw this crowd of men around a girl with long black hair. And they were really pulling her hair, not treating her right at all. So I went over to see what was happening, and it was our daughter Rahama. And she was preaching to them, I mean, to my astonishment. She had a very small little command of English language. I remember her saying to one set of men, you're all too selfishes, when you mean you're all too selfish. But she had such a burden for the people that she really got through to them. So I stepped into this crowd to tell them what I thought about their mobbing this girl. And I started to preach to them. I ended up preached 3 times a week for 7 years. So, never say you won't do anything, because you'll end up doing it. And really, we unintentionally, without planning it, built a congregation out of those meetings. And there was, amongst a few people, a real hunger for God. Most of the people were callous and indifferent and disillusioned because of, well, we'd won a war and lost so much and won very little for the war. So, at any rate, we would preach in Speaker's Corner, Marble Arch, and then invite people to number 77 Westbourne Grove, which became quite a well-known place in those circles. Well, that meant getting on a bus and traveling, at least a couple of miles, a little bit more. Then you had to get out of the bus and come to this private residence, climb 5 flights of stairs to this large upper room, which is the only, as I said, the only house in the whole row that had this extra room. And that was where we held our meetings. And we held meetings there for probably 7 years. And during that time, many people came to the Lord. Many were baptized in the Holy Spirit. Some received miraculous healings. We never grew to a large number of people. God was always at work. One of the most remarkable things that I've never seen duplicated anywhere except in Scripture was one evening a man came up with crutches who was lame and been injured. And we prayed for him, and he was healed and threw away his crutches. And there was such an outburst of praise and worship. I say this very carefully, and I have witnesses for it. The whole room where we were worshipping was shaken with the power of God, and continued probably for half an hour. And some of our neighbors in the street said to us the next day, what happened to your building up there? It was shaking. So this was an objective experience. It was not something subjective. And we saw many wonderful things happen there, but always on a small scale. And eventually, I felt the Lord opened the way for me to go to Kenya to become the principal of a college for training African teachers in Kenya, which was where I ended up after leaving London. The invitation to Kenya came because a Canadian Pentecostal mission had a teacher training college which was approved by the educational department of the government of Kenya, but they couldn't find a suitable principal anywhere in Canada who was willing to go to Kenya. So because one of my daughters had already married a man and moved to Kenya, they heard about me and offered me the job, and I accepted. So at the beginning of 1957, Lydia and I and the two youngest girls flew out to Kenya. The rest of the girls had by that time launched out on their own. Several of them were married. And so we arrived in Kenya. And God has given me over the years a very special love for the African people. It was quite exciting to arrive in Africa. And for the first time I found people who really wanted to hear the gospel. You didn't have to argue with them, you didn't have to convince them, they just were hungry. And so I ended up 5 years as a principal of this college. And we enlarged the college, we doubled the size, we took in women students. And I remember, I think the first year that we had men and women students graduate, we had 60 students that graduated. Every one of them had been saved and filled with the Holy Spirit. And even today in Kenya, many of them are serving the Lord in significant positions. One memorable thing in Africa was we saw two people raised from the dead. Two of our students. The one was a man, his name was Noah Mulera, and later he became headmaster of a school. Well then, one of our girl students became desperately ill, and Lydia and I went to visit her, and by the time we got there she was dead, and quite definitely dead. So I did exactly what Jesus said. I put everybody out, and Lydia and I knelt on opposite sides of the bed, and we prayed. And she suddenly sat up and said, "Has anybody got a Bible?" So I said yes, and she said, "Read Psalm 42." So I pulled my Bible out and read Psalm 42. Well, she was healed, but she was probably a little weak. So Lydia and I took her to our home for a few days, watched over her. I said to her, "Why did you ask me to read Psalm 42? Well, she said, and she didn't say when my spirit went out of my body, but that's what she meant. She said, "I found myself walking in a very narrow path, and there were two men in white on either side of me. And I came to a place where there was a lot of bright lights and people singing, and there was a man reading the Bible, and he was reading from Psalm 42. So I wanted to know what was in Psalm 42. And it's really rather remarkable because each of these students, quite independent of the other, had the same experience when their spirit left their body. That is, they were escorted by two men in white along a very narrow path, leading to a place with many bright lights and many people singing. Then we had many significant experiences in Kenya, but one of the, I think the most permanent in its consequences, one of our women students, her mother died. So Lydia and I drove out to the funeral. I have never seen poverty so vividly portrayed. And they dug a hole in front of the African hut. And the hut had been partly damaged by fire, so its roof was incomplete. And the mother was buried in a dirty white nightdress in a very inadequate sort of box and lowered into the ground. And there were these African women, all Christians, singing choruses in their own language, which was Luragoli. And these two little girls, very scantily dressed, running around crying. They're the two youngest daughters in the family. So the elder sister came to us and said, I'm going to have to give up my training because I have to go and look after my sisters. So Lydia and I talked it over and said, we'll take your sister. You can complete your training. So we did. So we ended up with two little, I suppose one was about 3 and one was about 5, a little younger. I received a beautiful letter many years later from the elder girl, which I have somewhere, and she said, for the first time in my life, I slept in a real bed. I had real sheets, and somebody took me in arms and held me. So eventually, this life is so, eventually the girl graduated and she could take her sisters back, so we let them go. But Lydia said, I'll make you some cookies before you go. But we had to go to a meeting of the missionaries on the station, and very late. So when we came back, the girls were asleep. But I always remember Susanna saying to Lydia the next morning, I think you forgot to make the cookies. So that we thought was, as much as we would do. But then one day, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we were sitting in our house, and a rather strangely assorted group of people came up, a black African couple and a white woman. And the white woman was carrying a small black baby wrapped in a very dirty towel. And so we invited them in, and they sat down. They said, this little girl's mother died when she was giving birth, and the baby was found abandoned on the floor of an African hut. And they picked her up and took her to the hospital, and they've kept her there for 6 months. Now the hospital tells us we're not a children's home. We can't keep her. So we've been going around every family in this area, African, European, or Asian, and saying, will you take this little girl? And we went to the hospital, and the hospital said they couldn't take us. But they said, why don't you go to the Princes, because they take children. So when they arrived, we said, well, that was true long ago, and we couldn't possibly do that now. We have our educational work, and we're very, very busy. So they said, well, maybe sit down for a little while. We're so tired. So they sat down, and we gave them some water to drink. Then they got up to go, and as the white woman went past me with the baby in her arms, the baby put out her left hand straight towards me, as if to say, what are you going to do about it? And I looked at Lydia. She was on the other side of the room. And normally we would never make such a decision without praying and talking together. And Lydia said, give me a week to get a crib and some baby clothes, and you can bring her back. So that's how we got our 9th daughter, an African daughter. Well, we inquired about the little baby, if she had a name, and they told us, yes, it's Joska. So we all started calling her Joska. It was several years before I discovered that really that was the way the Africans pronounced Jessica. So I now call her Jessica, and most of the members of the family still call her Joska. Anyhow, the time came for Lydia and me to leave Kenya on furlough, and the question arose, what's going to happen to Jessica? And I said to the various authorities, I said, if you will get her on my British passport, we'll take her with us. Well, they were completely without anybody else to take Jessica. So they wangled it and got her on my British passport. And she traveled with us to Europe and to Britain, and then to Canada, where we spent a year. I was doing some Bible teaching and what they call deputational work. Then I felt the time came for us to leave Canada, and I had an invitation from an American Assemblies of God pastor, whom I'd known when he was in the forces in the Middle East. And he'd always said, if you're ever in North America, come and visit me. So I got in touch with him, and he invited us. So we set out from Canada by train, which is a beautiful journey through the Rockies, and arrived at Winnipeg, then took the train south to the American border. Well, we must have been a strange-looking group. There was me, there was Lydia, who was a lot older than I was, and there was this little black girl who was about 3.5 at the time. And so when we got to the American border, they said, "What are you coming for?" And I said, "I'm coming for a visit." And they said, "How long?" And I said, "About 6 months." And they said, "That's too long for a visit." So I've had to deal with a lot of different people at similar situations. So I said, "I know you never argue with them." So I simply said, "Well, maybe you can help us." And they said, "Well, come in to Minneapolis and we'll help you to immigrate." I had never even thought of immigrating to the United States. And I mean, it was an amazing response. Also, I learned later that I had to immigrate under the Indian quota because I'd been born in India. So anyhow, I immigrated to the United States with Lydia and Jessica. And in due course, we became American citizens, all of us.